Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see so many people. We have had just an overwhelming response to today's event with our three distinguished guests, and I'm not surprised because it's a topic that is so relevant to and interesting to so many of us. We had Mark Burrows and Padraig and here last year, and Barbara Mahany is joining us this year, and can't wait for that. But before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Meg Weston. I'm a co-founder and the director of the Poets Corner. And the Poets Corner was founded in June of 2020 by myself and my dear friend, Catherine Seitz, who is no longer able to join these sessions, but she and I were sheltered in, if you remember, June of 2020, and delving into poetry and writing and really missing a community around that. So we created the Poets Corner to create community and expand that community among writers and readers of poetry and short prose. And we have events usually the second Sunday of every month at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Today, we have people joining us from all over the world, but I'm here from the Bahamas today, where I am on vacation, and Mark's in Camden, Maine, and Barbara's in Chicago, and Padraig's in Ireland. So even our participants are all spread out. And isn't that just a wonderful thing that Zoom can do for us? So, but this event we wanted to do on the first Sunday because it's Rilke's birthday, and why not? What a great way to celebrate. But before we begin the program, I just want to tell you about our upcoming events on the Poets Corner, and I hope you'll come back for them. On January 8th, we have Poems from the Night Sky. And we have this wonderful filmmaker who did a film called Defending the Dark about creating dark skies in Maine so that we can see the stars and continue to see the stars. And we'll show a short trailer from the film and talk a little bit about the Dark Skies Maine project. We have Mitch Goldberg joining us, who's just edited a book called Outer Space, 100 Poems from Cambridge University Press. And we'll have some of her poems and a couple of other poets read poems about the night skies. And in February, we have an open call for people to submit their poems. This will be our third annual Valentine's Day February reading. This one is entitled Love Letters, and we're asking for submissions of epistolary poems. And they can be romantic, they can be humorous, they can be addressed to your husband, your lover, your spouse, your friend, your dog, the earth, whatever you love. We want to see your love letters, and we'll send more about how to submit. And we'll choose probably 10 to 12 readers to read in our February event. And then on March 5th, we'll return with a prose event called Stories. And we have Laura Bonazzoli, who's recently released a novel and stories called Consecration Pond, and Morgan Talty's story collection called Night of the Living Res. And that should be a wonderful event. Just a reminder that we are recording today's event, so you will be able to find it on our website within a couple of days. So now I want to turn it over to Mark Burrows. I'm going to just do a brief introduction of Mark. He's both a friend and a neighbor in the town of Camden, Maine. And as I met him and was introduced to him 2 years ago, he was one of our first readers on the Poets Corner. He is a poet, and he's also an award-winning translator of Rilke's poetry, as well as other translations. He translated Rilke's Book of Prayers, and he has forthcoming books, a number of them coming out, Living the Questions with Rainer Maria Rilke, that was co-authored with Stephanie Dowrick, Heartwork in the Art of Living, a new translation of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus, as well as a translation of poems by the German poet Hilde Domine. His recent collection of his own poems is called The Chance of Home. Mark will introduce our other distinguished events, but now please join me in a very warm welcome to Mark Burrows.
Thank you so much, Meg. And it's wonderful that so many of you have been able to join us today, tonight, this morning, whatever the sun is telling you. And I'm so happy and really grateful for Padraig's return this year and for Barbara Mahany. I'll introduce each of them separately in a moment. But it is right, today, December 4th, is Rainer Maria Rilke's 147th birthday, it would have been, born in 1875, and lived a relatively short life. He died at 51 years old in 1926. And in so many ways, Rilke is a figure who straddles the centuries, not just the 19th and the 20th century, but the centuries that bring us into our own time and place. His poems, if anything, have gained in their resonance as we live into continually ever more fragmented times and indeed perilous times. He was a visionary poet who was extraordinarily devoted to the work of poetry. He was not an occasional writer. He worked every day, and he, in a sense, gave us a vision of what an artistic life could look like. Not an easy life, not an uncomplicated life, certainly often a very difficult life. But he ended one of his most familiar poems, his poem on the archaic torso of Apollo, with the imperative, "You must change your life." And as I muse about that claim of Rilke's, what becomes clearer and clearer to me as I grow older with his presence in my life is that his poems themselves are invitations to change. The experience of reading one of Rilke's poems calls us, invites us to enter into the change that's happening throughout the cosmos we live in and within each one of our lives. So it's a joy to be in the presence of this inspired and inspiring poet who always invites us to expand our inner life so that we might have a more spacious way of living in the outward circumstances of our days and our nights. So welcome to all of you. And it's first my joy to welcome Barbara Mahany to Poets Corner and to this celebration of Rilke. I've known Barbara for many years. She was, in the beginning of her career, a pediatric oncology nurse. Talk about a challenging vocation. And then for more than 30 years, wrote regularly for the Chicago Tribune. Wrote columns, reviewing books, commenting on cultural issues, always finding the story that you can never forget once you hear it. She's published a number of books since leaving that work. Slowing Time, a beautiful meditative book on seeing the sacred outside your kitchen door. And then Mother Prayer, Lessons on Loving, and has a forthcoming book called The Book of Nature, The Astonishing Beauty of God's First Sacred Text. Barbara, I'm so delighted you're with us today to share a bit of your own journey with Rilke's poems, and join me, if you all would, in welcoming Barbara Mahany.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to Mark, who didn't mention, but he was my once upon a landlord. Thank you for inviting me into this world of spirit-infused poetry, and for this particularly exhilarating invitation to join in the Rilke celebration with two of the most soulful poets on the planet. beloved Padraig and Mark. Mark told me to cast aside my pages of annotations, just uncork my heart. And so with a nod and a prayer, here goes. What draws me to Rilke? A few things. Most profoundly, perhaps, is the intimacy of Rilke's God, a God who might whisper in our ear or take us by the hand, a God to whom we can freely confess that we've broken the world we were given, a God whose breathing we listen for, a God who will not leave us dangling, a God sealed beside us. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who I've been reading of late, wrote that what our ancestors felt in full measure was God's spirit, an almost palpable closeness, an intimate closeness. In fact, Sachs explains that Shekhinah, and forgive my Irish Catholic Hebrew there, Shekhinah is the Hebrew word usually translated as divine presence, but it's actually something more striking. Its root, shachin, is a neighbor, the person who lives next door, God who lives next door. For centuries, Sachs writes, we were the God-intoxicated peoples, and somewhere along the line, that intimacy for many has been lost. But mine has always been a God of the whisper, a God of the softest, barely perceptible brush against the back of my neck, a God I recognize when I break out in goosebumps. Another thing, the way Rilke plays with what I call something of a peekaboo God, for me anyway, a God, or simply you in Rilke's vernacular, a God who is sometimes beyond reach, glimmering just beyond our knowing, and sometimes as near as the whisper as we're walked to the edge of night. I've written that ours is a God best caught in the sideways glance, the peekaboo glimpse, apprehended as the 5th century mystic and sage John Cashin long ago wrote, quote, in darts and illuminations at unexpected moments, or as Emily Dickinson put it, in slant. Rilke to me romps between darts and illuminations, slant, and skin to skin intimate. It's a play in light and shadow, seeing and unseeing. In Rilke's poetry, you might say God is made and unmade. And as Mark points out in his magnificent, very dog-eared book of mine, very post-it noted, Rilke's language reaches toward what it recognizes cannot be grasped. And it's that ineffability is the very thing that makes poetry, for me, the art that goes hand in hand with searching for a God. It finds a way in. And Rilke, to me, seems to be urging us to move into that space of unknowing. Mark makes that point over and over in his work, allowing uncertainties to be our guide. And over the years, more and more, from a Catholic grade school childhood, marrying a Jewish man 30 some years ago, always having been deeply, deeply ecumenical and looking beyond borders and boundaries. The God I find is sometimes I catch God at a glance, but long pages might go by where I dwell in that unknowing. There's a particular resonance for me with Rilke, this poet who wrote in a letter to a friend of his quote, most timid devoutnesses. Timidity is a word that actually fits much of me. And coming out of a newsroom where I was most comfortable as a writer who wore her heart on her sleeve, It's a whole nother level of naked to bare your soul, which I do now in large measure. A doorway opened by my friend Mark Burrows, my once upon a landlord, whose apartment we walked into. I saw Mark's apartment with literally floor to ceiling books, shelf after shelf after shelf of books I would die to read. He had a ladder so I could get to the top shelves, bless him. And we lived in Mark's Cambridge, Massachusetts apartment for a year when my husband was a Nieman Fellow for journalists at Harvard. I got to tag along, and I said many, many times, I didn't even need to leave Mark's room, Mark's apartment, Mark and Uta's apartment. My fellowship was the Mark Burrows bookshelf apartment of bookshelves. But anyway, I now do write a lot about the sacred in my life. And I can relate so deeply to Rilke referring to it as a most timid devoutness. Finally, for me, Rilke explicitly is a poet of the search, a poet who embraced deep solitude and whose search is propelled by a longing for encounter, palpable or otherwise, with God. And for those keen to the search, and I count myself among them, Rilke points the way, especially in his collection of poems he saw as prayers, which Mark has brilliantly translated in this book. And it's from this book that I will pick. I've picked my two prayers, prayers, poems, prayers, whatever. So I finally decided on two poems for this afternoon. Both of them are taken from Mark's book, Prayers of a Young Poet, which was the first of the three books Rilke wrote that made up the Book of Hours. And originally Rilke called this collection of poems simply the Prayers. And they're written in the persona, as most of you, many of you probably know. Rilke had just come back from his first trip to Russia, and was just so taken by the spirituality he felt there, the sacred pulse of all of Russia. So these poems are written. There's this persona of this little monk, this little Russian Orthodox monk who is writing these prayer poems, and I sort of fell in love with this little monk. So it was a tough choice. I could have picked and would have loved to have also picked poem number 6, which is the image of the little monk in his cell, not hearing the breathing of the one next door, and the one next door is God. And worrying, the little monk worries that should God become thirsty, who will be there to offer a drink? And the little monk says to God, give me a little sign, I'm very near. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poem. But I am going to begin with two that speak so deeply to my heart. The first one, and Lucas is going to put it, he's going to share the screen so you can all read along with me, or I'll read it, you can read it. It's poem number 60, God Speaks, written by Rilke, translated by our friend, Mark Burrows. God speaks to each of us only before we're made, then wanders with us silently out of the night. But the words uttered before each begins, the misty words, are these: go, you who are sent out by your senses. Go out to the boundary of your yearning. Clothe me with a garment. Grow like a fire behind things so that their shadows spreading all about cover me always and utterly. Let everything happen to you, beauty and dread. One must only go. No feeling is too remote. Don't let yourself part with me. Near is the land you call life. You will recognize it by its earnestness. Give me your hand. I read this as a gestational poem, an origin story for all of us, one that allows us to reframe our own beginning. It's a poem that situates me in the thinnest thin place I've ever known, the delivery room. 3 delivery rooms, actually. The one where I was born to an anesthetized mother, and the ones where I was doing the delivering as awake and on high alert as I have ever been in my life. It's a poem that carries us from womb to birth canal. Yes, a birth canal poem, to deliverance, obstetrically and theologically. It's the intimacy of this poem that draws me in so palpably close, the most intimate voice of God, the voice of a God whose breath I can almost feel against my cheek or blowing in my ear, as each holy word is whispered, whose palm I feel taking mine. God speaks, the poem begins. It begins with listening, the most important command in Judaism. Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel. We begin in our own creation, but we're not left there. God walks with us silently out of the night, the mystery, the unknowing. And then right away, it's instructing us, Rilke's instructing us to lean into our senses, our knowing beyond words. Trust the wisdoms that come by touch, by scent, by sound, by barely perceptible flickering of someone else's face. Clothe me, make me visible, make me real, but keep me in the shadows. Be my front man, maybe? And here's the line that is everything to me. Or this next section is everything to me. Let everything happen to you, beauty and dread. Here's where we find a God who's unflinching, who knows how dark it will be and how hard and terrifying and how beautiful, how breathtaking. This is a God who knows we'll suffer, we'll bury ones we love and feel our hearts shattered as we do so. And this is a God who knows we will watch the dawn explode in fiery streaks and watch a baby belly laugh for the very first time. Dread and beauty. Near is the land. Here's the crowning, the precipice, the part where everyone and all the breathing in the delivery room is held. And we await the cry to break through the silence. But God says, in Rilke's poem, you will recognize it by its earnestness. This is serious stuff. There's an urgency. There's no trial run here in this land called life. This is your one sweet go at it. And then, alone there on the precipice, facing the whole unknown, mustering the courage, certain we're facing the deepest aloneness we've ever known, God reaches out and in 4 short syllables conjoins, give me your hand. An implicit vow. A vow typically is a promise to God, but here it's turned on its head. It's God's promise to us, sealing our souls together. I don't know if many other people, maybe many people read it gestationally. For me, it was really powerful, a really powerful way to see it through that lens of delivery, of birthing. because it allows us to replay our own beginning, inserting or reinserting God into the frame. It makes me realize I wasn't alone, born to an anesthetized mother, but God was there. And as I lay on that delivery table, pushing with all my might, awaiting the crowning, the cradling, God was there too, sealed to both of my boys. So it's a poem I love. Lucas, can you put up poem 62, please? Here's a beauty. You, darkening ground. Again, Mark Burrows' translation of Rilke. You, darkening ground, patiently you endure the walls. Perhaps you'll let the cities endure for another hour. Grant 2 more hours to the churches and lonely monasteries. Leave 5 more hours of beauty for all the redeemed, and see yet 7 hours for the peasants' daily work. Before you again become forest and water and growing wilderness at the hour of ungraspable fear. Then you'll demand to take back your uncompleted likeness from all things. Give me a little more time. I want to love things in ways no one has yet done, until all of them become worthy of you and wide. I want only 7 days, 7, on which no one has yet written, only 7 pages of solitude. The one to whom you give this book, which envelops these hours and days, will stay hunched over its pages unless you take him in your hands and write these things yourself. This is a poem I read as lament, with elements of confession, of plea, and ultimately the line that echoes the set point of my being, the very essence of my everyday. And when I first read it here, it crumpled me. It knocked the wind right out of me. To see your heart's truest whisper spelled out in poetry is to feel the stillness in a room rise up and seize you. And we'll get to that line. So we begin with darkening ground. And the question is, why is it darkening? My first thought was, it's blood. Rilke was writing during ominous times in the history of the world, with a world war on the brink. What's interesting is in Hebrew, Otuma is the word for earth, for ground. And the root of that word, dam, in that word, is a Hebrew word for blood. So I thought it was interesting. Why is the ground darkening? And ground is Otuma, dam is blood. The question that comes to my mind is the ground God? Mark might have thoughts about that as the scholar of Rilke that he is. And then we have this patient enduring the walls of the world we've broken, the walls we have erected in our balkanized world. And then we've got these hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, 7 hours, this inverse hierarchy. Before you again become forest and water and growing wilderness at the hour of ungraspable fear, apocalyptic terror, forest and water and wilderness. And you take back your uncompleted likeness, strip away the divine authorship, but it also suggests the reality that creation is always unfinished and ever ongoing. And here's the line that is everything to me. I want to love things in ways no one has done yet. This is the whole poem for me. To see these words spelled out, part of this apocalyptic deal with the divine, one last plea, the final promise, the instruction to look to the margins, love everything, look to where the unloved are waiting and withering. It's the single.
Hi, good to hear from you.
Oops. It's the single instruction by which I've lived my life, the set point of my heart, to love my children thusly, to love the dawn and the bird song. It is the sacred pact at the heart of those who read the book of nature as theophany, as God making God's self known through the flutterings and rumbling and cacophonies of all creation. And then we have this fascinating last stanza when we see our little monk hunched over the pages, and the monk wants only 7 days. 7 is a sacred frame of time set by Jews who constructed 7 days into. I heard someone speaking recently about most of our rhythms tied to time, a day, the seasons are all tied to the rotation and revolution of the sun and the moon, but there's no construct for 7 days being a week other than the Hebrew Bible and the Genesis story in which God created the world in 7 days or in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested. And so 7 is this sacred frame of time. And our little monk is asking only for, give me 7 days. 7 days might be enough to love this world into wholeness. 7 days, 7 days to do what? We're not certain. That's a topic for conversation, perhaps with Padraig and Mark a little bit later. What are we doing in those? What is our little monk doing in those 7 days? And so I believe that is where that poem takes me.
Mm.
And Lucas, can you take it down? Oh, there we go. There we go.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing so intimately and movingly about these poems and about your own journey into that dark aliveness of being. We're going to shift continents, shift genders, shift frames to invite and welcome Pádraig Ó Tuama to share with us. Padraig is an author of many books, those that are always on my shelf. This one, Readings from the Book of Exile, and In the Shelter. And most recently, a book that's just come out, and I think it's available now, which is Poetry Unbound, a marvelous collection of 50 poems that Padraig has selected and then reflects in a way that only Padraig can do on the ways these poems speak or stumble towards speech and move us into the most intimate things that we need to face in our lives. Padraig led the Cormelia community in Ireland, the oldest peace and reconciliation community in Ireland. And among all the things he's known for, his On Being broadcasts, which are amazing, and I'm sure many of you know him there, also called Poetry Unbound. I think, Padraig, what I've known about you ever since I first heard you and now met you online in these ways is that you're the perfect embodiment of what the Germans mean when they say you're a mensch. And it's such a joy to welcome you back, and a warm welcome to you from Ireland.
Thanks very much, Mark and Barbara and everybody. It's so nice to be with you. I love that you didn't explain what mensch means. I'm delighted to be living in what I'm sure, coming from the graciousness of you, Mark, is a compliment. But I like the idea that it's not. That you've just make you very Irish. You always insult the people you like.
Oh, that's not an insult. That's a high praise. Mensch
Oh,
is
I know
a
it is.
human being, but it means a mensch is somebody full of life and full of vitality and full of darkness as well. Light and dark all together.
Well, that's true. I'll take that. um, I'm really pleased to be with you and pleased for us to be here on Rilke's birthday. I was born in 1975, so I can always remember the year he was born because he was born in 1875. Um, I thought I'd talk about two poems, and just as a little refresher, some of this has been said already, so I'll skip over some of my notes. But I had kind of been circling around Rilke for a number of years. There was a few of his poems that I loved, but I didn't feel like I knew enough to say that I loved them because I've spent too long being educated in theology. I always feel like I need to know the breadth of something before I can say that I love a particular text or a particular line in an ancient text. There's something that in me that wants to have a broad brushstrokes view first. And during a long winter lockdown, my God, at the end of 2020, I can't remember which number lockdown it was, when we had a limitation of the amount of miles from your home you were about to go. And there, I think it was November, and like you kind of don't see the sun really until about April in Ireland. Not that it's terribly cold like other parts of the world; it's just miserable and grey. And my dear friend Pat in Glasgow said, "Well, let's read a book together and meet every Sunday on Zoom." And we decided on Mark's translation of the Book of Hours, Prayers of a Young Poet is what it's rendered in, out I think with Paraclete Press. And it was a great comfort to do it. I actually used to keep the book down by the kettle, and I always have a cup of tea on the go. And so whatever poems I was reading during the week, I'd read it every time I boiled the kettle. And it was a lovely way to do it. And I felt like I developed this relationship with Rilke and got enough of a broad brushstroke, which was really helpful. Mark's introduction at the start of the book is lovely, as well as an introduction to the art of translation. And again, I think I have studied too much theology to be too happy with flimsy translation. I always want to read a translation where the person who's translating has wrestled somewhat. And of course, then there's a variety of ways within which a poem can emerge. And like this book, the Stundenbuch, the prayer book, the Book of Hours that Rilke produced, is an echo to a book that people would turn to during different parts of the day and different cycles of the year. Early evening and night prayers, the different offices of the day. And in a book of prayer, in a prayer book that you'd find in a monastery, there's prayers of confession and prayers of request and prayers of rage and praise and blessing and fury and prayers you don't want to turn to because they're prayers to send somebody into the earth, and prayers of joy and prayers of confusion. And I find that in the Book of Hours from Rilke, taken, as Barbara had said, and written in this persona of this Russian monk. And I'm always moved by the ways within which Rilke held complicated things together. I'll talk a little bit about a few of those, but one of them that he held together was eros and prayer. And that is often a very difficult thing to hold together, is the erotic and the transcendent. And he held that together. He was kind of introduced to much of his interests in Russia through his lover, Lou Andreas Salome. And they were lovers for a few years and then lifelong compatriots and influences with each other. She was an extraordinary writer herself in psychoanalysis and in many other disciplines too. And she it was an intellectual and artistic companion his whole life, and an erotic companion for a period of his life. I wouldn't ever have wanted to have been one of Rilke's lovers myself, or his wife. I don't think he would have been an easy man to have been formally tied with, because in a certain sense he owned his heart and he gave his heart away all the time. I think at times he didn't know how to hold it, so he gave it away in order that he could see it. You can see that in God, his relationship with God, this great you. I saw somebody mention that in a chat, and you can see it in his poetry. And I think he would have been very difficult to have been a spouse of. And the first part of the Book of Hours was written in 1899, and the last year of a century is always a year of looking forward to the next century and feeling like, what can we see now? And in a certain sense, in the small persona of this monk, the Book of Hours has a sense of foreboding, and you can feel a certain sense of that foreboding in parts of it. One of the things that makes me turn over and over again to Mark's translation is that the monk in the persona of the first part of the Book of Hours wrote little notes at the bottom of each poem, and very few of the translations preserve those little notes. They're almost like marginalia. I suppose they are marginalia, written at the bottom, sometimes at the top. And it isn't Rilke. He wrote them, but he's writing them in the persona of this monk, at times listening to another monk cry in a cell nearby, and wondering about going and consoling that monk, and what is happening. It's just another layer around the layer of the poems. So he was young. He was 25 when he was writing some of these poems at the start, and I find them very tender. And I wonder if we could look at the first one, the one that's from the Book of Hours. I love the dark hours of my being. I wonder if we could put that up. I think that'll be coming up on the screen, provided the email that I tried to send went through. Maybe it didn't. Oh, thank you very much. So, from the Book of Hours. I love the dark hours of my being, for they deepen my senses. In them, as in old letters, I find my daily life already lived, in holy words, so soft and subdued. From them, I've come to know that I have room for a second life, timeless and wide. And at times, I'm like the tree, ripe and rustling, standing above the dead boy's grave, gathering him in its warm roots, fulfilling the dream he'd lost in sorrows and songs. And then down the bottom there, you see what Mark has included, and many other translators haven't, is this little marginalia, in the woods on the 22nd of September. And that's written almost as if the persona of that monk is giving us a little bit of insight. Often those dates, it's a date, it's a location, maybe it's a time, there'll be some little recognition of the weather. Sometimes they go on for a few lines though, and give all kinds of strange detail, some of which have nothing whatsoever to do with the poem that you're reading. And I love it. It's another piece of wildness, and it shows his imagination. And again, I think what it does is it shows how Rilke was restless in terms of a home place. He seemed to be permanently in exile, and in a certain sense at home in exile. He was moving and he was static all at the same time. And in a poem where there are two narratives, where it isn't entirely clear how they're in conversation with each other, I feel like in a strange way you're being brought into the tension with which he lived his life. And those marginalia don't necessarily give keys to fully understanding the poem. They just give another directionality of it. And it's the tension that it suggests is where I find so much of the art. And that tension doesn't bring you into any conclusion. Sometimes, of course, it can give a couple of layers, but it doesn't give you a final conclusion. I'm not interested in conclusions when it comes to Rilke. I am really interested in entering into a strange and sacred tension that he seemed to hold. So the first line in this one, I love the dark hours of my being. What a classic line from him. Darkness is the place of enlightenment, and storms also, and the portending of a big new century also as a strange time when much will be revealed. He's interested in bridging gaps, you know, and these tensions I mentioned about spirituality or prayer and erotic, darkness and light, God and humanity, self and other, and self and other selves. Now and eternity, you find a very fluent relationship in him between now and eternity, and the made and the unmade, the present and what will die, and then the resurrecting, this strange organic sense of humanity and of God living and dying all at the same time. And these dark hours deepen his senses. He seemed not to be addicted to the certitudes that you often find in religion. And there's a cascade of things. The dark hours of his being certainly have multiple purposes. You know, you see a couple of lines into it. He says, "In them, as in old letters, I find my daily life already lived." Old letters, is that a sense that time is repeating? Is it that he's written a letter to somebody in a strange way where, unbeknownst to himself, he's speaking about the future? Is he speaking about a sacred text? Who wrote these letters? And how would he find them? And where did these letters come from? And is it a letter that you send? Or is it like a letter, A, B, C? Is he saying that the alphabet, in a certain sense, is a way that all of his life has been lived and he's finding a way to read it? Um, I was listening, I was driving down earlier on, and there was a program on RTE radio, the poetry program it's called. And there was an Italian poet who's just won a big prize in Ireland, and she's a translator, and she was saying that poetry translates the world. And in that sense, one of the crafts, the tool of the poet, the hammer and nails of the poet, are letters, A, B, C, D, E, 26 of them, maybe a capital, maybe lowercase, a couple of squiggles for questions and M dashes. And in a certain sense, what he's saying is a praising of the letters by which we can live our life. And then he's come to know that he has room for a second life in the dark hours of his being. And then there's that extraordinary change in the final stanza here. At times I'm like the tree, ripe and rustling, standing above the dead boy's grave, gathering him in its warm roots, fulfilling the dream he'd lost in sorrows and songs. I've come across some translations where that final verse is omitted or toned down, where perhaps the brutality of the dead boy's grave, it's that word boy perhaps is too much. Is God the tree holding the boy in its arms? Who is that dead boy? Rilke was brought up in the shadow of death, a sister who died, and Rilke was dressed as a girl for the first numbers of years of his life, almost like a substitute daughter who was no daughter. And in that you can see how he needed to have a second life and a third life and a fourth life, because he was brought up in living death in a certain sense. And then he was sent off to military school. For a sensitive boy, that would have been a complicated thing. But yet the letters to a young poet were written to a boy from that same school. And so you see that even in a place where death was, his early experience showed him that he will have to find a way to enter into it with tenderness. And so sometimes I think of him being the dead boy's grave, and also him being the tree, and that God is the tree also. In all of these, he finds something beautiful. But the tree will die also, and the you that you find in Rilke's poetry, this transcendent, extraordinary, made and unmade, almost godlike you, is made in being called you, is summoned into being by the one who's summoning them into being. And that, I think, is a powerful way within which Rilke is shaping God in the shape of life and death. And I think that is eminently trustable, possibly frustrating to theologians or anybody who wants there to be a doctrine from this, but I don't think he's interested in creating a systemic philosophical system. He's a poet, and he's feeling his way through the world, translating the human experience of transcendence and decline over and over. I wonder if we could look at the second poem. Thank you. We'll only look at this for a few minutes before we're going to have a little bit of time to chat. This is Edward Snow's translation of Autumn Day. Lord, it is time. The summer was immense. Lay your long shadows on the sundials, and on the meadows let the winds go free. Command the last fruits to be full. Give them just 2 more southern days. Urge them on to completion, and chase the last sweetness into the heavy wine. Who has no house now will never build one. Who is alone now will long remain so, will stay awake, read, write long letters, and will wander restlessly up and down the tree-lined streets when the leaves are drifting. There's a way at the start of this that I think is quite extraordinary. Lord, it is time, the summer was immense, lay your long shadows on the sundials. It's almost like he's the maestro of God. He's telling God and time what to do. And who is he? Who appointed him to be the usherer in of the divine action in the world? I love the unself-conscious arrogance of place that he gives himself. The summer was immense, lay your long shadows on the sundials. He's participating in the cycle of the year with no apology whatsoever for the place that he's given himself. And in that, I find a strange kind of humility. I mean, when you read around about Rilke, there was plenty of people who didn't like him at the time because they found him a bit much. And in a certain sense, I can go, yeah, I can fully imagine that must have been a bit much at times to see that place there where he is putting himself up there in conversation with God, congratulating God. The summer was immense, nice job. And then instructing the Lord to do the various things that he's doing. There are other ways to interpret these lines, of course, too. I'm only giving one possible one. But again, command the last fruits to be full, give them just 2 more southern days, urge them on to completion. And then again, you see this strange turn. What is this volta in this line? Who has no house now and ever build one? It really feels like some of these things are very close to his life. At one point he said, I have 115 letters to write before I will be able to feel caught up with my correspondence. And so when you look at, we'll stay awake, read, write long letters, and we'll wander restlessly up and down, it's hard not to think of him narrating himself and saying, in a certain sense, this has been the shape of my life and will continue to be the shape of my life. Restlessness, the leaves are drifting, things are changing, time is always changing. And in the midst of being caught up in time, he's also trying to step out of time, which he will do in death. And he has stepped into timelessness for so many of us who turn to him in the strange wonder of his words and in the strange wonder of his life and in the strange wonder of the you that sometimes was God, sometimes was himself, and sometimes is us. So back over to Mark, and maybe we'll have a chance for a couple of questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Padraig. That was moving. And that line, Lord, it is time, Herr, es ist Zeit. I mean, in a sense, Rilke is saying time is all that we have. It's the greatest of our gifts. It's this treasure that we can either squander, as in the last stanza, those who haven't paid attention have lost the chance, or we can be awake to it. And I think in some ways, Barbara, when you were telling the stories that brought you into those poems, reading them as sort of gestational birth narratives, the first one particularly, time is everything in those moments, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then in the second one, give me a little more time. I want to love, there's such an urgency. Do I have 7 days to love things in ways no one has yet done? 7 days. I think there's a lot of play with time. And, he died at 51. He's, one of those souls that maybe is presciently aware of the compression of time.
No, that's a good way to put it. I think often when I've listened to both of you, there are lines from the 9th elegy. So these are all early poems. The elegies he wrote in his late 40s, just before he died. He finished them in 1922. And in the 9th, why are the 9ths always so big? I think you think about symphonies, the 9th symphony of Beethoven or Schubert or Mahler, these epic things. And perhaps with that in mind, Rilke made sure this 9th would be in that place. But toward the beginning, he says these things. And Padraig, I'd love to have you comment, because being here matters so much. And because it seems to us that everything needs this here-ness, this fleetingness that so strangely involves us, the most fleeting of all, once for each, only once and not again. and we ourselves once, never again. But this once to have been, even if only once, to have been earthly, this is irrevocable. Padraig.
It's ecstatic and utterly beautiful, and it makes me think about the impossibility of the present moment. That there's like when does history begin? Just when I said that sentence, it's already in history. It's already past. And so, what is the now? And I think what he was looking for was the moment, and what it means to enter into what in theology you'd kind of call the kairos time. Somehow, this expanding moment that opens up. Annie Dillard in Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek has a great line when she's talking about people who had recovered their sight after, I think it was glaucoma operations that happened, and people were beginning to see things and were seeing things in ways that those who were accompanying them were finding mesmeric. And so at one point, somebody who hadn't seen for many, many years saw the sunlight on an evergreen tree and said, "Who put all the lights in the tree?" Um, Annie Dillard says, um, I have tried for years to see the lights in the tree, and once or twice I've managed. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like that. And I think she's saying in that prose narrative instance what Rilke is doing in that beautiful elegy there. Just hope, Marie, how does a similar thing, hoping to get in between the seconds just for a moment, and for that to expand in a life-enhancing midrash that expands backwards and forwards into your own time.
Yeah. And in a sense, Rilke abhorred understandings of religion that always pushed eternity into some future thing, because for him, the eternity was in that moment, in each moment, and becoming alive to the here-ness. He puts all these, he makes these words up to create, it is an ecstatic utterance. Then hier sein ist so viel. Being here is so much, if we're truly here, right? Yeah. Barbara, hier sein, being here.
Listen to the two of you for the rest of my life, I swear.
Yeah. Well, we've had what a marvelous beginning tasting of Rilke, just this little taste. And let me just read the next lines and then we'll open it up. I'd invite you, there are too many on to have a conversation, but for those who'd like to stay for the next half an hour, please do. And if you want to post a question or a comment that you'd like Barbara or Padraig to respond to, please do that in the chat line. But let me read the lines of the poem as it goes on. This is from the 9th elegy. And we push ourselves so, trying to achieve this, wanting to hold it in our simple hands with our sated vision and speechless hearts, wanting to become this. To whom should we offer it? Ideally, we should hold onto it all forever. Oh, and regarding the rest, beware, because what can you take with you? Not the way of seeing we learn so slowly here, and nothing of what's happened here, nothing. Well, then, the pain, and above all, the difficulties, which is to say, the long experience of loving. The pain, the difficulties, and I that phrase to me is everything, the long experience of loving, the one that's drenched with our joy and equally drenched with our tears and our sorrows and our failings and our discoveries, all these things that make our life the fullness that it is, that make it, in a sense, a moving moment of eternal time, the eternity of time in each breath, each moment of our lives. How's that sound to you, Padraig?
It reminds me over and over of a great poem of Emily Dickinson's where she talks about finite infinitude, and it's a way within which um, we live with death, and death is one of the things that preoccupies the living, and he knew that so well, and I do see Rilke as being aware of the fleeting moment, the dying century, the dying love, the dying self, death in itself. the dying impulse too, and opportunities that slip you by. I think he did know what it meant to yearn to be great, as well as to have to, in certain ways, come to terms with moments that pass you by. He knew that, and was critical of people who let moments pass them by, because he knew that in himself. Some of which were his own fault possibly, and others of which are because he wasn't in the right crowd, or he wasn't given the right kind of sense of connection, and yet he did yearn to know people of certain nobility. And so to know all of those things and hold the desire for infinitude, which is one of the things that inspires us to art, I think, to hold that in a sacred relationship and a tense relationship with the reality of death. It's one of the things I find so reassuring about him. And I am amazed that some of the things that I find so nurturing about that he wrote in his 20s. How did he know? And I'm not even sure he did know. Maybe that's why he needed the persona of the monk to bring something ancient out in him that he didn't know that he knew. He somehow was tapping into some unconscious elemental experience of that in him.
No, I think that's so true. I mean, he wrote these poems, 68 of them, in a little under 3 weeks, in September and early October of 1899. They just tumbled out of him. And there is something of this sort of deep sense of the moment in each of these poems that opens me, at least as I read them, not to try to find out about Rilke, but to try to find out about myself, about this precious, fragile life, fleeting life, and how that relates to other precious, fleeting lives around me. Barbara?
No, I mean, I think all of that is condensed into what I love so much about the poem I call the gestational poem. We're right on the precipice. I mean, God is just, I think it's God. We're, near is the land you call life. Let everything happen to you, beauty and dread. Joanna Macy's translates it as, beauty and terror, and, just sort of this omniscience and this unflinching sense of everything we're about to enter into, but just bathe yourself in all that life brings to you, and give me your hand.
Yeah, I'll never read that poem again, Barbara, without hearing the way you presented it to us. That sense of this God standing at this precipice and offering us a hand, not commanding us to do anything, not requiring us to do anything, not scolding us for doing the wrong thing, but simply offering a hand. Such a beautiful, powerful image. Yeah. Well, somebody asks here, how do
in the chat?
Yeah, I've got one from home, wherever home is. How do we live in the present moment, the eternal now, when, as you say, Padraig, the now nearly doesn't exist? I think exit, but I think exist. Does Rilke enlighten this at all, or could you?
You or Rilke, one of the two of you.
Mark, I think you could talk about Rilke's talking about that, and then yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, all we have is the now. That's all that there is. I mean, Augustine famously said, "I know what time is until you ask me to explain it, and then I have no idea." But he said, "What I do know is that the past is the now that isn't anymore, and the future is the now that isn't yet." But in a sense, the now is eternal in that sense that from God's eye, if we can imagine God as the one who is in and through and beyond time, every moment is present. And I think that's what Rilke's poems are asking us to imagine, that every moment is present. Now, I remember just quickly, a very well-known poet and who became a good friend was going through a very difficult time in his life. And he said to me, he asked me the question, he said, "Mark, you're a theologian and you're a poet. Can we change the past?" And I think what he was asking is, can we be present to the past and experience it for ourselves differently, and also invite others to experience that past differently? our regrets, our fears, our disappointments. And the poem you chose, Padraig, is in a sense, Rilke, I think, looking at his own life in part, as you suggested, and saying, I can live a second life. I'm not stuck with this life that was so miserable in my childhood. I can choose to live into this life that's timeless and wide, but very present in each moment.
I think that one of the great mysteries is what time is. We don't know. I love theoretical physics. I'm number 3 of 6 children, and most of my siblings are scientists and engineers. My father, at the age of 14, got a job in the physics department at the university and stayed in that job till he was 64. And so dinner conversations would often be about the nature of time and space, which utterly bewildered me. And nobody knows where I came from. Or my sister, I have a social worker sister. My father refers to us as the humanities department, and he doesn't have any respect when he says that. He thinks it's hilarious. And I have, though, as a consequence of that, learned to read some theoretical physics, Carlo Rovelli, and I find that they're in the hands of people who can write elegantly about time, and Emily Dickinson is another one. The mysteries of it come forward. Emily Dickinson says, the past is such a curious creature. To look her in the face, a transport may reward you, or a disgrace. And in the context of conflict resolution, when was the past, something that happened 10 years ago in the context of a bomb or a murder? It happened yesterday, and the past continues to repeat. What one person says is a long time ago, for another person is always present. So there are traumatic ways, energetic and beautiful ways, where the question about the past and what it is, and the present, and therefore what the future might be, is all being held together in complexity.
Beautiful.
I say all that because I have found no answers, but what I find comfort in is recognizing that the past is that time is always multiple at the same time, and that in a room, even of 2 people, of 1 person, certainly of a few hundred, time is already doing very different things. I have a love and a bewilderment for Meister Eckhart, that strange Dominican writer, monk, that Mark has also translated. And in one of the collections of Meister Eckhart's sermons, the very first words of the very first sermon, as it's arranged in that, and people differ as to the order of the sermons, but the very first words of the very first sermon in O'Callaghan Walsh's translation is "here in time," and then he goes on. And Meister Eckhart, he seems to be able to step outside of time and see something of the eternal moment, the same thing that Rilke was hoping for, the same thing that Annie Dillard was hoping for, the same thing that Emily Dickinson was hoping for, is to somehow be able to step in between the seconds and to see that time is doing something very different. And that poetic imagination about what might be at the heart of time if we were able to step outside of it might be something called the soul, might be something that people like to call God, might be something that we like to describe as the present eternity. It was that the book of Ecclesiastes says that God has set eternity in our hearts, and I think whatever poet wrote that has understood something about theoretical physics, about the nature of time, about quantum energy, and that they were trying to describe something that they perceived about time and trying to locate it in the fleeting experience of human existence. And so in response to what people were asking, that's where I go. I look to a mysticism about time, and I find it helps. It gives no answers, but I find it helps.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, as we stand before the shadows of our lives, particularly, it's not answers we want. It's reality. It's some assurance in the midst of the darkness that we're not alone. And that sense of aloneness draws us back to something that's living within us, beyond us, through us. But Padraig, here's a comment. What Padraig is saying right now, this is now 5 minutes ago, about being in the present, is in my favorite of his poems, You Who Never Arrived. And I'll quote those lines to you that Gail Schechter reminds us of. Streets that I chanced upon, you had just walked down them and vanished. And sometimes in a shop, the mirrors were still dizzy with your presence, and startled gave back my too sudden image. Who knows? Perhaps the same bird echoed through both of us yesterday, separate in the evening. Wow.
Beautiful. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
Oh,
Who knows?
it's gorgeous.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for those words.
Sent you a few questions that I saw in the chat from
Okay.
earlier. I don't know if you saw those, and I sent them direct to you.
Oh, I didn't see them, but
Copy.
why don't you read one? Somebody asked
Ah,
about
okay.
additions to use, and there are so many. I mean, the best thing to do if you read German is read the German, right? But if you have some German, there are some bilingual editions, and I would encourage you to use those. So at least you have the German beside you. But Stephen Mitchell is one of the celebrated translators of Rilke. Edward Snow has translated most of Rilke's cycles of poems. Robert Bly is the first place that many people met Rilke, and he was translating Rilke before anybody in English was much reading Rilke, or many people. That was back in the late 60s and early 70s. I still think his collection is magnificent. It's very free, but it has something of the energy in Rilke that sometimes is lacking in more precise translations that miss the pulse of Rilke. So, but
Mark,
read us one of those questions.
Well, last time, this isn't one of their questions, but one of mine is somebody said, would you each read another poem and say a word or two? But last time you read a poem in German and then read it in English, and it was just beautiful. I wonder if you'd do that again.
Absolutely. And there's one that I was thinking of reading. Let me just find it. My book is falling all apart here. Here, it's a very short one. It's also from this Prayers of a Young Poet. The poems that he wrote there, 68 of them, he eventually edited. So sometimes there are small changes, and didn't include those notes that Padraig was raving about, which are sometimes poems in themselves, these little marginal notes. But here's a little poem, which is magnificent. I'll read it in the German and then the English. Daraus, dass einer dich einmal gewollt hat, weiß ich, dass wir dich wollen dürfen. Wenn wir auch alle Tiefen verwürfen, wenn ein Gebirge Gold hat und keiner mehr es ergraben mag, trägt es einmal der Fluss zutage, der in die Stille der Steine greift, der vollen. Auch wenn wir nicht wollen, Gott reift. And that sense at the very end, even if we're not paying attention, even if we're not attending to our life, whatever God is ripening. It's one of Rilke's favorite verbs, reifen, to ripen. And in some ways, he thought that ripening isn't somehow nostalgic or sentimental. It's the growing into the fullness of who we are. It's that the line from the poem you quoted about bringing the last warmth into the heavy wine, right? Letting the grapes, if you know about grapes, letting them stay on the vines another 2 warm southerly days to absorb more of the liquid out of the grape so that the sweetness becomes more intense, right? But here's a poem in English. Because someone once desired you, I know that we too may desire you. Even if we renounce all the depths, when gold lies deep in the mountains and no one's there to dig for it, one day the river brings it to the surface, reaching in stillness into the stones, into their fullness. Even when we don't desire, God ripens. So, I mean, Rilke knew it doesn't all depend on us. It's not all about us. Actually, it isn't primarily about us. And that's the good news of this, that we're we're immersed in a life that's coursing through all of these beings and all of the things that are around us, the ordinary things. And that is the kind of fullness of the divine, of God's ripening.
Beautiful.
Let me turn it back over to Barbara or Padraig to choose one more poem.
Oh,
If you'd like.
I've got a very, I could hear your small intake of shock there. I'm just going to quote one line from an untitled poem, which is to Lou Andreas Salome, where he says, "Even your not being there is warm with you."
Oh.
I love that line. I'll say it a few more times. Even your not being there is warm with you.
Hmm.
Even your not being there is warm with you. I think in the great mystical traditions of poetry throughout the centuries, one of the things that you see in the Indian tradition through spirituality as well as mathematics is this fascination with zero, with nothing. What is the presence of nothing? What is the presence of absence? I see that in any simile as well. When somebody says, "Oh, it's like this," it means it's like it, but it's not the same as it. So there's a space between the things that are like each other but not each other, and in that space there's tension and there's electricity and there's the nothing as well as the something. And even your not being there is warm with you. To my mind, shows how Rilke, in his lifelong connection with Lou Andreas Salome, there is a sense that he's aware that much of what is brought out in love for somebody else is also an experience of the self. And what happens in the self when the other person isn't there? What do we do with that? How do we live with that when perhaps that's not reciprocated in the way you want, or it's reciprocated in a different way? Or when that person dies, or when you leave, who knows? And all those experiences are experiences of not being. And he turned that not being, whether it's another person or himself or God, he turned that not being into something to which he could give his attention. Even your not being there is warm with you. Oh, I love it.
Yeah. And, I think that reaches not just within our lives, but beyond our life into the grave. That is the sense of presence that can happen when we lose someone precious to us, who's never gone. Nobody could convince me that my father isn't sitting right now with me in this room, listening to my voice, and in a sense rejoicing in that voice. And that's, so absence, what is absence finally, but inattention on our part.
I thought of that when you were reading in German. I imagined Rilke somewhere in the room with you, and imagined how joyous, how he would feel to hear his words in his language on his day of birth. So Patrick, I wasn't exclaiming or gasping in shock. I was actually excited because I love this poem, but it's not as short as your lovely choice, but it's 6 that I alluded to before, and that I was so sad to not be able to include in my 2 poems. So is it okay if I read it?
Yes.
I love it. I love your translation, Mark. You, neighbor God, when I sometimes wake you with loud knocks in the long nights, I do so because I rarely hear you breathing and know you're alone in the vast hall. And when you need something, no one's there to offer a drink to your outstretched hand. I'm always listening. Give me a little sign. I'm very near. I'll stop there because I don't want to go too long, but it's so beautiful. And again, I guess I can't help it that I'm a mother because I think of the way mothers sleep and fathers, but with ears wide open and listening for the loud knocks in the night and making sure we hear the breathing, especially if there's congested little lungs. So anyway, I'm in love with our little Russian monk, and I love that the monk is worrying about the God in the cell next door.
What is the name of that poem?
It's Well,
he didn't.
it's
He
6.
didn't name any of
Oh,
them. So yeah, he didn't name any of these poems. They're all untitled, but
Yeah.
it's from the beginning of the Book of Hours, the very first part. It's about,
Page 40 in Mark's book.
yeah, it's about, 15 poems in.
And
something.
Patrick and I recommend you pick up Mark's book and inhale it.
Keep it by the kettle.
Yeah.
Keep it by the kettle.
By the kettle.
First of all,
Yeah.
by a kettle, and then keep it by a kettle.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And try not to catch flame on it.
What a wonderful program, Mark, that you put on. And Padraig and Barbara, thank you so much for coming. We have one question in the chat that asked, but somebody asked, were there any recordings of Rilke reading his poetry? And
No, we don't know. We don't have any recordings of his actual voice. It would have been possible that they could have made some early recordings. What I can say is he went on tours, reading tours, and in his day those were events. I mean, they are when Padraig is on the road too. They're events. I mean, people come and fill halls. They filled halls for him because when he read, people said, "I knew he was only reading to me," but everybody was saying that. They felt he was so present. Not performing the poems, but in a sense, birthing them. And he shared them without flamboyance because the energy was in the poems, not in some theatrical performance of them. So what we know about Rilke is that he had a somewhat high voice, a high-pitched voice, and a very intense voice. And the other thing that people wrote about him is his eyes. When you were with him, you felt like his eyes penetrated to the middle of your soul. He was so attentive in those ways. He didn't like crowds. He was, I think, a classic introvert, but he could stand in front of a crowd and draw each person in through the way that he made the words present, the way they were present through him.
And there's still that way on the page. I mean, when you read it, it's Rilke's taking the words straight out from your soul and you're finding them there on a page. And there's a lot of gasping.
Yeah, that's a good description. A lot of
But
gasping.
you have all done that for me this afternoon, and I'm judging by what's coming up in the chat. I think you've done that for so many people, just made these words come alive and engaged us. And if anybody wants to save the chat, there were all kinds of wonderful comments that came through. So I recommend you click those 3 little dots and save the chat. And this has been recorded and will be on the Poets Corner website within a couple of days. And Mark, do you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to close
words?
a closing word. First of all, Meg, thank you for making this possible to celebrate this birthday on this day in December 2022. And a special thanks, Barbara, to you and to Padraig for just the gift that you've brought us of your presence, of your realness, and of your deep questioning hearts and minds. It's just been an extraordinary day. I want to end just with a very brief reflection on the very last poem in this book, because Padraig mentioned that when Rilke wrote the first draft, which he simply called the prayers, he included sometimes just a little line, which probably was just what he was experiencing that day. He'd walked in the woods, and he said, "I wrote this poem after walking in the woods." But the last poem ends, and these were all taken out of the Book of Hours as it was published, because his publisher said, "Look, you can't just have this for part 1 and no comments for part 2 and 3. But Rilke said, "But that's the way I wrote them." But he lost. He lost that argument, as sometimes publishers make bad decisions. That was a bad decision. But the last poem, which if you didn't know this comment, you would have no idea what it's about. It's about Rilke coming, about this monk, this old Orthodox monk, coming to meet this old man. And often commentators who don't take the time to really find out about this poem think, oh, this is his image of God, how patriarchal this old guy. It isn't God. And Rilke tells us that. This is how he ends it. And I should say, when I did a reading from this book just after it had come out in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Grollier's bookstore, one of the great treasures of bookstores in the United States, all poetry. They moved all the tables out. They packed in about 50 people, and there were people standing out in the streets. It was an amazing time. And afterwards, there was a couple lingering. I don't know their names, an older couple. And they came up to me finally after the crowds had gone. They said, Mark, I just want you to know that we're Ukrainians. And the poem that you shared, and I'll read this in just a moment, is an old tradition that our grandparents still remembered. So their grandparents lived in the 19th century, the time that Rilke wrote this poem. And when he had gone to Russia, Ukraine was part of Russia at that time, he wrote this poem. The tradition was about the old blind bards, these blind people in the society whose job it was to collect the songs, to go from house to house, cottage to cottage, farm to farm, town to town, and listen to gather the songs in and carry them to the next village. Here's how he ends it. In the old chronicles, the monk had read about the venerable blind singers, the Kobzars, who in ages past wandered among the cottages as evening fell across the wide expanses of the Ukraine. It's heartbreaking to read this now, isn't it? But he sensed that one ancient Kobzar still journeyed through the land, going to every door marked by solitude, whose thresholds were overgrown and quiet from disuse. And from those who lived behind those doors and kept watch there, he retrieved his many songs, and these sank beneath his blindness as if into a well. The days are long gone now when these songs had left him in order to go their way in the light and upon the winds. All that resounds now is their echo. That's the last word. All that resounds now is their echo. In a sense, I think this is what this day for me has been, to catch these songs that have been woven into the hearts, Barbara, your heart, Padraig, your heart, and to hear the echo of the way you've brought your life, not just the poem to life, but your life to the poem and the poem through your life. And now we have the great gift of the echo. So I want to thank you, Barbara and Padraig and you, Meg, and to all of you who've gathered for this special day. We'll carry those echoes with us into these darkening days of December, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. And I wish you all a marvelous, a wonder-filled holiday season. Back to you, Meg.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mark. This has just been a wonderful, wonderful program. I just can't, the comments in the chat are just blowing up here. But we're going to end, and I hope people will come back in January, on January 8th, for Poems from the Night Sky. This is just incredible. So thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Repeat the